Cooking steak can be a little bit daunting with all the different options and price points. So whether you're buying a cheap or an expensive cut of steak, it's more about how you treat it and how you're cooking with it that's gonna make the biggest difference. Even if it's a cheap steak, you can still get great results. So we're gonna go over some cheap and expensive cuts of steak and ways to cook them both. So steak is just a term for a cut of meat that doesn't have a lot of connective tissue, which makes it suitable for quick cooking. There's a number of options when you're looking at inexpensive steaks. A good list to work off of are hanger steaks, tri-tip, flap, chuck eye steak, or chuck tenders. Hanger is also known as kind of the butcher steak. Chuck means that it's just coming from the shoulder. It's a little bit more muscular because the shoulder does a lot of work in its life, but it also has a good amount of marbling and great flavor as well. So because it is coming from the shoulder, it will be a little bit tougher texture than some of the other more expensive cuts and could be used for a lot of different things even outside of steak, which we're not going to get into. Another great flavor as well as textured steak is a tri-tip. This one you'll definitely be able to recognize right away because of its unique shape. It actually does have 3 separate kind of points to it. This one can be a little bit more difficult to work with. The size varies a bit, so by the time you get the middle cooked, the outside or the edges could be a little bit overdone. What you could do is cut this up into smaller pieces and treat them more like individual fillets. Flap meat. All right, flap meat. Woo woo. Not the sexiest name. This is similar to skirt steak or flank, but as those have become more popular, they're a little bit more expensive in the grocery stores now, so flap is a great option. It's a little bit different, as you can see. The texture is quite loose. That can be really great because it soaks up marinades really, really well. It's got a great color though. It looks like a prehistoric fossil in some way. While this piece can be quite large, you can cut it into different pieces, freeze part of it, and cook some for dinner tonight. This one would work great for a marinade since it's going to take on so much flavor and all those little crevices. You don't have to do anything crazy, but adding just a little bit of low-sodium soy sauce, some fresh ground black pepper, and a few crushed cloves of garlic would be a great simple marinade you can throw together really easily. All you need to do is put a clove underneath your palm, push down, and just kind of bruise it a bit. That's going to crack it open a little bit and just help the flavor release without having to do a lot of chopping or mincing. And you can let this sit in the marinade for anywhere from 30 minutes to overnight. Getting out all the air and then just kind of move the meat around in the bag and make sure that everything's touching the marinade. And then before you cook, you want to make sure that you dry off the marinade and get as much of it off as you can. You want to have a nice dry steak so you can get a good crust on it. If there's too much moisture left, the meat is going to steam when you put it on the hot skillet instead of getting a nice crispy crust. And using paper towels is great for this because it still is raw meat and then you can throw them away right after. The cast iron skillet is a great option no matter what type of steak you're cooking. Cast iron holds heat really well, but as you'll find in the other cast iron video that we did, it doesn't heat up very evenly. So if you wanted to preheat your cast iron skillet in a hot oven for about 20 minutes, that would be a good option. Once it's preheated, you can go ahead and pour in a good amount of oil. You can use any type of cooking oil, ideally something with a high smoke point. Once you're sure that your skillet and your oil are preheated, you can go ahead and carefully layer your steak in. It should immediately sizzle. There's kind of 2 rules of thought on cooking steaks, whether you should flip it often or flip it once. We liked to flip ours quite frequently throughout the cooking process to ensure that we're keeping an eye on the entire piece of meat and getting a good crust throughout. Also, by consistently flipping and moving the steak, you're ensuring that you're putting the steak on the hottest parts of the pan, which are going to give you the best crust. Especially if you're new to cooking steak and you're not as comfortable just feeling the meat to see if it's done, it's always a good idea to have a kitchen thermometer on hand. The most foolproof way is to use a thermometer poking right into the center of the steak, which is going to be the coolest part. For a medium rare steak, you want to serve it at 135 degrees Fahrenheit, but you can take it off a few degrees earlier because it's going to carry over cooking slightly. No matter what steak you're cooking, you always want to let it sit for a good 5 to 10 minutes after it comes off. This gives the meat time to let the carryover cooking take place. The steak will be a more even temperature throughout, and it also helps the meat relax a little bit. The high heat is going to make all those fibers kind of tense up, and resting will let them relax a little bit and be a nicer texture in your mouth. This is one that you definitely want to cut against the grain. Because those fibers are so loose, you can really see where they are. It's going to make sure that it's a little bit easier to chew, and it's going to be a nicer texture in your mouth. Sometimes people are freaked out by the red juice that comes out of a resting steak. That's actually not blood, it's myoglobin. It's just a protein in the muscle fibers mixed with the water and residual moisture that's left in the meat. Some of the cheaper cuts of steak have a little bit of a stronger flavor, so they're great to use with marinades because that beef flavor can stand up to the flavors in a marinade. If you are looking to indulge a little bit more, there's a lot of great options on the higher end as well. Starting with the New York strip steak. This is kind of your starter steak, if you will. It has a good amount of fat, a good bit of marbling. It's going to be more tender than something like a chuck and have a good flavor. Some key indicators are the fat cap along the outside, as well as pretty good marbling throughout. It's also called a Kansas City strip steak or a sirloin steak. The tenderloin or the filet is going to be the most expensive of all the options because it's coming from a very small part that is right under the spine. It does almost no movement throughout its life. Therefore, it's very, very tender. It almost melts in your mouth. A nice tenderloin should still have a good amount of marbling throughout. Should be a nice, bright color. Some say that doesn't have as much flavor. What you're paying for here is the really soft texture and the rarity in the sense that it's a very small part that comes out of the cow. Ribeye is also known to be one of the most preferred and most expensive steaks. It has a good balance of marbling, texture, and flavor. There should be good large chunks of fat throughout it. You can get a ribeye bone in or out. Some people will say that the bone imparts a lot more flavor, but I don't necessarily feel like it makes a big difference, but it's, a nice showstopper if you're looking for a medium rare center. Going about 1.5 to 2 inches is preferred so that you can get a nice crust on the outside while still preserving that medium rare center, which highlights the flavor and the texture that you're paying for with the ribeye. If you want something that's a little bit more well done, I actually wouldn't recommend going with a thicker cut steak. So with a steak like this, it really doesn't need much seasoning. The purest way is just with salt, and you can do this at least an hour before you're about to cook it. You can even salt it overnight. And what that's gonna do is give the salt more time to penetrate. It's going to help flavor as well as tenderize. If you're gonna be salting it overnight, we recommend covering with cling film. If it's only gonna be for an hour or so, you can actually just put it in the fridge uncovered. So what we're gonna do is actually do the opposite of the traditional sear then bake method. We're gonna bake ahead of time and sear later. What this is gonna do is we're gonna slowly raise the temperature of the steak in a low oven, and we're gonna put that in for about 30 minutes until the internal temperature is around 90 or 95 degrees. At that point, we're gonna take it out, get a really, really high heat on our cast iron skillet. Again, it should sizzle right away. It should be a really, really hot pan. The great thing about the reverse sear method is that you're cooking the meat itself in the oven, and then you're just finishing it off in the skillet to get a really great crust on the outside. There's a little bit wider of a margin of error here because the temperature in the oven is going to be much lower than on a hot skillet, so you have more time and wiggle room to get the temperature right before you're searing it on the outside. If you're going to cut it into slices, it's a great idea to cut the bone out first. It's going to make it a lot easier. Because we gradually rose the temperature of the meat in the oven before, it's not as much of a shock to the meat when you're throwing it on a hot skillet. It doesn't need to rest as long as a pan-seared steak would. The texture is quite fine, and it doesn't make as big of a difference the way that you cut it. Of course, it's great to cut it across the grain, but it's not going to be as striking of a difference. Really, all you need to cook a great steak is a thermometer, a good cast iron skillet, a lot of salt, and some oil.
Hey there, thanks for checking out CNBC on YouTube. Be sure to subscribe to stay up to date on all of the day's biggest stories. You can also click on any of the videos around me to watch the latest from CNBC. Thanks for watching.